3 Hugo Awards, 23 Chesley Awards. Donato Giancola is a legend in science fiction and fantasy illustration. He's worked on book covers by Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, J.R.R. Tolkien, Arthur C. Clarke. The list goes on and on. He even did some work for the US Postal Service. We've got him next. He's this week's interview on Into the Ultra. Hey everyone, welcome to Into the Ultra. I'm Brian Stillman, and I'm here today with Donato Giancola. He is a science fiction and fantasy artist who has worked on Magic the Gathering, a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, the Middle-earth role-playing game Stratego, which I think is really cool. He did some cover art for Stratego, but he's also worked on a number of book covers from authors like David Brin, F. Paul Wilson, Marion Zimmer Bradley, Ben Bova, Larry Niven. Donato, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me.
So first, I want to jump right in and talk a little bit about science fiction book covers and approaching science fiction as a visual medium. Because I think a lot of people think of it in terms of movies, they think of it in terms of books, but there's a strong visual component to science fiction. How do you approach something like that, where you're envisioning the future, you're envisioning technology, you're envisioning things that don't exist, that possibly can't exist?
Right.
Where do you come from when you're creating those worlds?
Well, interesting that you mentioned that, because when I look at science fiction, I very much come from it as a point that it's a story to tell to contemporary audiences. You and I, the fans here, that I actually don't get that interested in the technology because, right? Because you see like the old science fiction when they would get involved, right? You know, if you show your Apple computer in the painting, you know, how dated those look.
Yeah.
Right? Or even if you try to guess like what technology could be, it's probably not going to be what we see. So in a way, what I focus on, even though I love the idea of future technology, I focus on the stories of the people, of their relationship to the content of the story and the relationship of them to their environment, their world that they're involved in. That is a challenge, right? How do you envision the future?
I mean, one of the things about science fiction is you're ultimately telling stories about people. How do you convey that visually? How do you get into, I mean, you've got one frame. How do you get into the narrative of a person that will accomplish all those things that you talked about?
Well, that is one of the most difficult parts of being a book cover illustrator. You mentioned, like, you know, people know science fiction movies, right? They read, you can read science fiction stories, you can read science fiction comics, and all through that, those mediums, time is part of it, right? Time is part of the experience. As a book cover illustrator, there is no time.
Right.
Your time is like judged, you know, based on like what you have to do in milliseconds, because that's how long a person spends scanning the bookshelves looking for something to read. So has been very challenging.
How do you zero in then on that moment, that single frame? How do you do it? What is the secret?
I can't tell you that, and then I'll never have a career. Like everyone will copy it, and like I'll never have a job again.
Okay, what kind of things? What kind of things do you think brings drama, brings excitement to an illustration? Whether it's science fiction, whether it's fantasy, what are the kind of things that can help convey that energy that makes a good illustration, a good painting, good cover art?
Right. You know, those things do vary. Each artist has their own interpretations of like what they feel would be a successful. But for me, I find that it is a character's, like the main character, the person's viewed, their connection to the world that you see within the frame of that picture. Almost always my characters are interacting with some aspect of that world, interacting with an element,
right?
Maybe reading a book, looking at an object, going through a portal, right? So there's an active engagement with the character and the world. And again, it's actually related to stories, which kind of goes all the way back to like gaming and D&D.
Right.
I love that aspect because it's about story.
Donato, you're talking about storytelling and finding that moment where they're doing something, interacting with that environment. When I've interviewed people like Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley, and one of the things they talked about, D&D artists, is finding that moment before an action, that moment after an action, that moment that is like kind of anticipates action, and
Right.
you end up telling a story through that. The reader fills in some of those blanks, like what led up to the carnage on the field, or what's the person about to do as they're punching in some secret numbers on a scanner. Do you look for elements like that? Is that something you can turn to as an illustrator?
Actually, yeah, those are those are parts of storytelling that actually I teach to my students now. How I teach to other professionals is finding I call it they're in between moments that are non-critical. Typically, they are non-climactic in a story. But for me, what they do is they actually reveal the character of the person much more so than the climactic moment. Because a climactic moment becomes kind of iconic, becomes so grand, bigger than that person.
So what do you love about science fiction and about science fiction illustration? What takes you back to that genre?
Wow. Oh, I mean, science fiction has really deep roots in me. Basically from movies, from comic books that I would read as a kid, and even just as a gamer. My friend Vinny and I, after role playing this game Space Opera, I don't know if it was like I pulled out this stuff, so I brought up this old
Wow.
Space Opera, and this was who was this Fantasy Games Unlimited.
Oh, okay.
And it was a role playing game we played. So, and then we found that the rules were restrictive, so we started making up more rules and making our own game from that. But I guess the point of so that stuff, science fiction has always been, I think, a part of who I am. So telling stories about it, it was like fantasy. It was just a way to spill out my love of narration. And actually world building is, I love science fiction for the chance to, in a way, predict the future, right? I mean, that's what science fiction is mostly done for, is these alternative futures, where are we going as humanity? So that's fun.
Do you ever, I mean, obviously you're creating the worlds that are working with the author's stories, but one thing I've seen in your work is there are certain sort of aesthetic elements that you often return to, the style of armor or a spacesuit or something like that. But they're little things. But in your mind, is there ever that sense of, you know what, this is kind of all one giant world? Like the people who are floating in space dealing with some weird alien construct might run into the people who are down on the planet for some other book cover. I mean, obviously they're not literally the same worlds because it's author A and author B, but
no, but I know, actually, I see what you're getting. Yes, actually, I have done that, where I've done a couple covers for one author, and I really enjoyed that world, the technology I built, the architectural structures or the costuming, and I liked it so much that a couple years later, if I'm reading a totally different author and I get triggered and kind of want to come back to that other world, I do that. Yeah. So they end up getting an extra, visit from that other authors. I think it's kind of a little disingenuous to that new author to get slapped with that style. But as an illustrator, I know, but I love doing that because it makes it feel cohesive, right? It's suddenly you're not doing other people's ideas. Suddenly you're the artist and you're doing your world. Really fun.
So Donato fans who are out there, now you've got a mission. Find those books that seem to create a cohesive world for you, working with Donato's work. But then don't tell anyone, because we don't want to upset any authors.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where the robots that you talked about before, the empathetic robots, I call them. They started as purely standalone images, one all by themselves. But a series of those robots has evolved, I've seen them more in a single world, or probably more like a universe rather than a world, but the idea that they are more cohesive. And then now when I make a new version, a new element of that, I'm intentionally trying to use similar aesthetics to unify that series.
So the empathetic robots, let's talk about that. That's a series that you've been doing over a number of years, it seems, of
11
robots.
years now. Yeah.
11 years.
11, yeah.
Wow. And these are of robots interacting with people in different scenarios, really bringing a sort of level of humanity to them and to these situations and their interactions with people around them. What inspired that? It's a great series. It's great, great art.
Well, I've always loved robots. That goes back to either seeing in movies, C-3PO, R2-D2. All right, I mean, all the way back that far. And over the years, I've received a few commissions to do book covers that would have a robot in them. But many times, the author was dictating what the robots look like or had a feel to them. So going all the way back to like what I do with robots is I always had this infatuation with robots. Being a painter, I always also the tactileness of making steel, making patinaed surfaces on robots, doing the mechanical structures. And over the years, as good old digital technology has invaded the science fiction world, our change in what robots are. Like, actually, example, Battlestar Galactica, right? Cylons,
right.
Metal suits, bouncing eye.
Cylon from Battlestar Galactica.
That's right, totally, right? That's what I grew up with.
Right.
Now, new Battlestar Galactica, they look like us. Right. Also, our awareness of technology, of like what it is to be artificial. And actually, this is Philip K. Dick. His androids you could not distinguish them from human. That was the challenge in Blade Runner, the movie, for Decker to distinguish, right?
The Voight-Kampff test.
Right.
Tell me, Donato, you encounter a tortoise, it's on its shell, and it's struggling in the heat. What do you do? Are you an android, Donato? Half the viewers are like, what is he talking about? Did he just have a stroke? There's a movie called Blade Runner that if you haven't seen, you absolutely have to see. Not just to understand how this interview is going, but because it's an amazing, amazing movie.
So that passion for like world building, mechanical construction, was something that had been kind of denied as the change in aesthetics in the books that were written. No robots no longer were that way. And so I wanted to make robot paintings. And that's what started, the re-investigation of that.
Well, your robots are, what strikes me is they're very mechanical. They're not covered in fake skin or anything like that. And like you just said, you can see the patina on the metal and lots of little plates making up the thing. The elbow joint is distinct from the arm and the muscles and the fingers and the faces, but you still seem to be striving to connect a humanity to the empathy to them, to give them empathy.
Yes.
Why? What are you trying to accomplish with that? Where are you looking when you approach those paintings?
So for me, like when I work with my robots, they are actually people. The way I think about them, the way I have them interact within their environment, but also since I want them to be non-human, right? That's why I strip them of the skin. That's why I reveal their mechanical nature, so that they work as a duality. They both are a machine, yet they're also a personality.
How do you capture that empathy? How do you imbue them with empathy? How do you capture those moments? Like I'll notice it in the way the robot might be holding a wounded person, or their gestures, their interactions with the world around them. There's often a gentleness to them that to me conveys a certain soul or however you want to approach it.
It's exactly what I do. Is I just place and construct real human moments, and yet have a robot kind of be a displacement for humanity. So, but it's more than just a displacement, because your mind, when you see the moment, you're both going, oh, I empathize with that, right? I
Mhm.
understand what that robot is doing. And yet at the same time, it's a robot. It's
Right,
not
right.
supposed to have, right, emotions. So it's this duality, like you're projecting empathy and yet conflicted with it being a machine.
Mhm,
And in a
mhm.
way, that's what I want you to, so in a way you start empathizing with being a robot. What I love about it is that it puts you into the shoes, the hardware of being a robot yourself as you engage with this empathetic, non-empathetic battle over your actions or seeing those actions performed.
So you did a book cover for one of my all-time favorite authors. You did The Star's My Destination for Alfred
Oh,
Bester. He wrote a short story called Fondly Fahrenheit. It's about a human and his robot, and the robot is committing a series of murders. And I don't want to get too into it because I don't want to really
yeah.
spoil the story, but this notion of empathizing with robots but feeling detached from robots and admiring robots and all these different things come into play and make for probably one of the best science fiction short stories ever written.
Oh,
Bester was also a stylist of unparalleled caliber, so that
yeah.
helps a lot. He pulls off a neat literary trick, and it's an exciting story, and it's a little bit terrifying, written in the 50s. But it makes me think of that a little bit. They have the
That's
human
why. So,
nature in
yeah. So that's
their
why.
electronic DNA.
That's right. That's why I intentionally make them
Mhm.
look so humanoid. I'm trying to build a world where the robots are our caretakers, our
Mm,
parents. They walk, like you said, they walk amongst us. They are empathetic to us, yet they also protect us. And in a way, they can dominate us at any moment, right? They
right.
have strength, they have the longevity, like to outlast us for real, right? Like I've got a robot standing on the edge of a waterfall. The robots, or he or she, is trying to cross the waterfall, and you're looking at it. It's like a real tense moment because it's like, oh, a precarious drop and all that. And for me, what I'm thinking is the robot is waiting in geological time for the river to dry up, and then it can just walk across
Right.
because
They're in no rush.
they're in no
Right.
rush, right?
Yep.
So
That's
that's my thinking. It's like there's no tension there. It just has to hold on to what the little thing that it's holding on to
right.
until the river dries up, until it freezes over in winter, whatever, and it can then change, right? So it's sense of time, right? That's one of the aspects that we don't get as humans. Time is of the essence in everything we do.
One of the things that I love about what you just said was this idea that when telling these stories about robots visually, however you want to approach it, um, the sense of time gets tossed out the window because they're dealing with geological time. They're robots; they don't have to worry about it.
Yes.
Um, that kind of gets to another thing that I've loved about your science fiction work. You do a lot. I don't know if this is part of a series or just something you return to in general, but astronauts
Right.
in space dealing with these gargantuan, mind-boggling structures, and you give us no clue as to what they might be. You know, some are kind of like portals, but some are just weird structures in
Right.
space.
Mhm.
Alien and astronauts interacting with them. It gets to this sort of great sense of wonder, this scope that I love in science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke did
Well,
it.
that's yeah.
Um,
Right.
so, can you talk a little bit about your approach for that? Can you talk a little bit, whether it's about the astronaut series or this idea in general, sense of wonder in science fiction art?
Interesting, because that's almost the opposite. Like what you're talking about with the astronauts is the opposite of what I'm doing with the robots. The
Right,
robots
bringing very human. Yeah.
very, very intimate human moments. Whereas when I tap into those astronauts, then I'm back into like why I started doing science fiction in the first place. Like you said, that sense of wonder, that idea of exploration.
Mhm.
You know, when I was a kid, I remember very distinctly growing up, lying on my back in my parents' lawn in the backyard and looking up for satellites at night. You know, this is also when the shuttle was going up. So I try
Right.
to like spot the shuttle when it was up in orbit, and very distinct memories of that and thinking and looking at the stars and envisioning, you know, interplanetary travel, where we might go. So that wonder is really a very, again, a deep part of who I am and why I make these kind of paintings. So yeah, the astronauts are specifically about that, about the unknown like 2001, Arthur C.
Yeah.
Clarke. There's also the Sci-Fi series, which is now on Amazon, I believe. The Expanse. I don't know
Yep.
if you've.
Oh
If you've
yeah, The Expanse is
Again,
fantastic.
so right? Yeah, I mean about the alien technology, right? And awareness that you are now like like someone else beat you there, right?
Right,
Right?
right. We are blips in the universe.
That's right.
Arthur Clarke talked about advanced science, and science that's advanced enough might as well be magic to us.
That's right.
He
Yeah.
phrased it much better than that because he's Arthur C. Clarke and I'm not. But um,
Right.
that mystery of here's this giant thing, and scale comes into
Right.
play a lot. And I've
It
noticed that
is.
you play with that in your art. The people are great, and then they're surrounded by this
Look at
thing.
that. I don't. Oh, let's see. It's buried somewhere. I'll have to say. Like when I was in high school, National Geographic published a map of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this was in the '80s, like mid '80s, so they didn't have the Hubble telescope.
Right,
So,
right,
but it showed you the scale relationship.
right,
Earth, solar system, local, local star cluster,
right.
local arm in the galactic structure, the local superclusters of galaxies, and then that place. And so, even then in high school, I was super aware of our diminutive scale.
We are motes of dust. Yep.
I mean, not even motes of. I mean,
Right,
it was like like Horton Hears a Who, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the world within that world is, and that's within that world, and that's so that I carried that around with me in high school, and sharing it with my friends, but using it in science fiction, so.
Why
Very
is
much
that so impactful? And why is it something that you're able to play with in your art? Why does that hit us so strongly, do you think?
It speaks to all of us. Like, why did Magellan go around the world? One of my great dreams was that we might be alive when and if we send a probe to Europa, the moon around Jupiter, and find something there, find some kind of bacterial structure, life, something that is not here, not from Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that it's weird that is actually, I think, part of why humanity has spread across the globe. It was the programming, that early animal upright walking ape in Africa that had the urge to radiate out, the urge to travel, and that 2 million years ago or so is genetically hardwired into us and that's why we are a successful species.
Well, that's because we found the monolith, and the monolith in 2001 fixed our DNA, boosted our intelligence, our DNA, boosted our intelligence, and sent us out there. Come on, Donato, get your history right.
I've got the
Monolith, right?
here.
The monolith was made by Apple. Thanks, Steve Jobs. You take this attitude and this approach where the great unknown, the expanse of space is this adventure and this wonderment. That is not always the science fictional approach. H.P. Lovecraft based the deepest parts of his fear on the unknown. The idea, the most terrifying thing out there is the thing we don't know about. And the worst thing that we can do is knock on its door. But you're coming at it from the opposite direction. There's inspiration there. Why is that something you like to explore?
Wow. I think it's just hopeful, and I think it's exciting. I mean, when Hubble, like the Hubble Space Telescope, first got launched and sent back, once they corrected the lens, right? Corrected the mirror and all that. When they started sending back those pictures, it was humbling. It was beautiful, right? Seeing those shots of other galaxies, seeing other nebulae, so sharp and crisp and beautiful and imaginative, and better than what our imagination could present over what was out there. So I think that, and even like now, like we just had a probe go by Pluto, and getting up close, detailed shots of Pluto and how fascinating it was and how different it really was. Or even so I don't think it's hard for me to follow, rather than thinking about depressing. Well, no, I can do the depressing too, because I think like it's like I kind of don't believe that we will ever leave the solar system. The limitations on physical material, the limitations of speed of light travel, right? The idea of, you know, the wonderful warp speed of you know, of Star Trek, the wonderful hyperspace of Star Wars probably don't really exist. They probably don't.
Thanks, man. That's just great. After
I'm
all this
sorry.
uplifting
It's
sense
just,
of wonder,
it's just the
we
physics
are
are just not there for that kind of, you know, taking that many atoms, keeping them all
right.
right, and being able to move
But
them. So
that's
fast.
why we need the aliens to come visit us so they can
Yes.
give us the tech that makes it work.
Right. So we're going to be left to observing and robotic probes that, again, will take decades to get to another stellar structure, you know, even like going super fast.
Right.
It's still going to take decades.
But that's why, I mean, that's why we have art. That's why we have
Right.
literature, movies. They can give us these ideas and give us these notions and take us places where we can't go, which is what I think,
yes, exactly.
to sort of bring this back to some of the things you explore. I mean, that's what we're getting from, say, the astronaut series and things like that.
Right. Yeah. That sense of wonder that
yeah.
because it's about inspiring, because we don't know where we're going to go. We don't know like where the new thing will happen. So if you stop looking, you won't discover anything.
Right.
So you have to keep looking and hope that something pops up. Right. I think that's important to keep that going.
So we've talked a lot about robots. Do you have a favorite robot from, whether it's movies, whether it's TV, art? Do you yourself have a favorite robot?
The whole Star Wars story is a story of C-3PO and R2-D2, right? And no matter where you are in the story, either there's C-3PO or R2-D2. So it's almost as if they were the narrators. And so R2-D2 was always my, even though he never spoke, so to speak, right? But I mean, he tweeted, obviously. And I always loved him, it as a character.
Well, that gets to that imbuing them with empathy. All he does is make beeping noises,
I know,
and yet there's so much personality and life there.
He's a garbage can.
Right. And yet we know how he's feeling. We know what he's doing. And then you have C-3PO, who's capable of very humanistic emotions. Those are good robots to go back to, man.
Yeah, I mean, because in a way, I don't. Here's the catch: as a young man, I didn't read that much science fiction. It wasn't until into my much later teens that I was introduced to novels, to reading. So it was like when I was 18 and 19 was when I really started reading science fiction and fantasy. So most of my engagement with science fiction and fantasy and science was with movies or with gaming, through the gaming world. Yeah. So robots, there weren't that many robots actually in. I mean, except for Asimov's iRobot, but again, I didn't read that. Actually, I still haven't read iRobot. I've read some of his other books, but I haven't read iRobot yet.
Despite the robot series, the irony is rich.
I know, right?
Is there a piece that you were particularly excited to get the commission on, a cover, science fictional cover that was particularly exciting for you? And can you talk a little bit about that?
The Do Android Dream of Electric Sheep, getting that commission from the Science Fiction Book Club. That was a real thrill to engage on that and come up with a solution. Again, the challenge, the androids look like you and I.
Right.
So how to convey that essence and communicate that to an audience. And so that was a really great challenge. Basically what I did was I wanted to show the way Rachel, one of the androids, was perceiving our world. And so I wanted to show her being human and the human world being alien and cold and steel. So she is fleshy bodied, and then everything around her is harsh steel. Everything's made out of chrome, because that's humanity's attitude towards the androids was they were just something to abuse, to use up, right? To kill when necessary, to not even treat better than animals. So it was really like a horrible abuse of this life form by humanity. So I wanted to show, I think of the worst kind of way to present that on a cover is this abuse of the woman Rachel by humanity. So it's that was an edgy concept. I didn't think they would go for it. Luckily, I had an art director, Matthew Calamitas, at the Science Fiction Book Club. He was able to back it up and got it through.
Do you find there's often a lot of freedom in these types of assignments, science fiction and things, because it's so broad, it's so open? I mean, there's so many things to explore. Do you, as an artist, are you often given that kind of wiggle room to play with your ideas?
Yeah, like I think that's what I've enjoyed about being a book cover illustrator, is that most of the commissions do solicit you to be very creative and very broad with potential concepts for pitching those back to the art directors, to the editors. So I've really enjoyed that as a book cover, as an illustrator for that. Whereas in a lot, like doing a lot of like magic cards or gaming art, they're highly narrow, they're very concentrated, right? Like you got to do this scene and these characters, and here's their costumes, and here's the world that's already built.
Right.
And so you're very limited in terms of the creative outputting from your own internal experiences, your own internal ideas for those kind of products. Yeah.
Well, you just mentioned magic, so maybe that's
Okay.
a great place to seg. I want to talk about some of your fantasy work. I know fantasy is near and dear to your heart as well.
Right.
We've had a lot of conversations about Dungeons and Dragons. You are a gamer, longtime gamer, so really coming at it from a place of your own personal feeling, and a
Right.
huge Tolkien fan as well. How did you get involved in doing fantasy art? How did you get involved in? Did it start with book covers as well, or was it gaming?
Oh wow, you're talking as like a professional.
Yeah,
So it's like, yeah. I mean, it's. I think you got to like move back the dial there,
right.
It's,
well, let's talk. Yeah, let's talk about that, because as a kid, I've seen some of your drawings from when you were a kid. I've seen some of your maps. So talk about that. Okay. You know, fantasy art and Donato.
Fantasy art. So here we go. Fantasy art is this stuff. This is a book of D&D maps. Just like tons of maps here, like literally dozens of hand-drawn maps.
And these are from you when you were a kid?
This is from when I was in high school.
Okay.
And that's what I did with all my free time, was make maps, make dungeons. Like here we go. Here's a book, ring binder filled with pages after pages after page of dungeon descriptions. Look at that.
How did you have time to learn to paint?
That's one of them. So I never played most of my gaming experience is building my own worlds and my friends playing in my world and it's not just my world, it's a world we collaboratively build together.
Sure.
And I think that's a foundation that built such a strong foundation for me as a creative person, so that I always knew how to tap into my own ideas and project them then into problem solving.
Right.
So yeah. So I'd always drawn as a kid, and then when Star Wars came along, I drew science fiction. When D&D came along, it switched into fantasy art, and so I'd always drawn. And so luckily the development of me as a professional, luckily I was able to go to an art school, get some extra training, and it was very easy to see, like now looking back, it's just a continuous line of where I was going to go. Like with my art, it was like obvious I was going to become a fantasy artist. Just I lived and breathed it.
Do you find that there is a different sort of freedom when you work on fantasy stuff versus science fiction? I mean, science fiction, part of its power tends to be in a sense that maybe this stuff is at least like 1% possible, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
with fantasy, you can have Gandalf riding a giant eagle. It doesn't matter. Like, oh, you want to have a bunch of trees walking through across the field? Go for it. Do your
Right.
thing. We don't care. Gaming, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is full of it. It's like, owlbear? Sure, why not?
You know what? That you're right. Fantasy is like anything goes, right? So that, yeah, that is a fun aspect of fantasy. But to be honest, I luckily was able to also think about science fiction in a similar way. But the anything goes now isn't about having, the giant creatures and all that. But the anything goes for me is about the world building, the architecture, the sense of wonder. Alien, you can go really crazy with aliens. You can go crazy with alien architecture. You can go crazy with starships and star fields, which is what, again, you don't really see that as much in Dungeons and Dragons. You don't see the world, the extension of the outer world, someone in low Earth orbit, right? You don't get that in fantasy, where really you could, right? Right? But no one does, right? They don't. That's the realm of science fiction.
So one of the things, a theme I see you come back to with fantasy a lot in your personal work, and obviously some book covers, Tolkien seems to be a big part of your life. I remember you once gave me a look when I had admitted at one point that I had not read Lord of the Rings. The look you gave me, I was like, well, I just lost a friend. That's it. I mean, I'm dead to him now. I'm very familiar with the story. It just took me a long time to get to the books.
You saw the movies.
I saw the movies. And I'm making my way through Lord of the Rings finally. I just lost like 100 viewers because they're like, what?
No, because here's a catch. I've only read Lord of the Rings, I think, 3 times now.
Okay, only?
Well, I know.
I guess by Tolkien standards, that's not a lot.
By fandom standards, I am not a fan. Right.
But you clearly have a love for Tolkien. You clearly have a love for Lord of the Rings. So why is that something you like to explore? Why is that a world that you like to put yourself in with your art and to explore this thing that already exists? So now it's not you, whole cloth creating this thing. It's exploring a world. Where's the appeal for that for you as an artist?
Well, it taps into that childhood persona, like who I am, what I am. Reading Tolkien was a huge motivator. It was, I just had playing Dungeons and Dragons. My older brother, Michael, came home one day and handed me a book. And he said, hey, we just finished reading this in school. You might like it. And it was The Hobbit. I didn't put it, I remember he handed it to me Friday afternoon, and I finished it by Sunday afternoon.
Right.
I did not put the book down, basically. And that led to Lord of the Rings, which then led to the Silmarillion, which then led to Unfinished Tales, the Book of Lost Tales, Part 1, Part 2. So you're starting to see, like, I just consume this stuff, and its parallels, obviously, or I should say, how D&D was based off from much of the adventuring structure of elf, dwarf, wizard, human fighter, halfling.
Right.
I mean, the adventures and all the different lands. So it just runs like it's a wellspring of source material, both for my gaming, from my gaming experience, from my literature. It was one of the first novels I had read on, my brother, like on my own, not something signed. So
how do you explore that as an artist then? Where do you find entry points into that world where you get to flex your creative muscles?
Well, it is limiting. It's kind of like doing the Magic the Gathering cards, is that there is a pre-existing world, right? These characters are defined already by their actions, by Tolkien's words that he's written. For years, for probably a good 10 years or more, I didn't really do hardly any Tolkien art. So it wasn't until I received commissions to do the trading card for the Iron Crown Enterprises and Middle Earth trading cards for them, which then also led to some cover commissions from Valentine Books that then opened up this potential that now, I had these skills as a book cover illustrator, a painter, that as a young artist, even a young professional, that I didn't have. And I could now paint as good as what was in my head. And so let's try, let me interpret Tolkien. Let me go to these moments. And again, I kind of sought after those in-between moments that we talked about, those moments that are non-climactic, that reveal the humanity of the character. And so those are the scenes, those are the things I've been painting out of Tolkien's world, are the ones that many of the other artists aren't touching.
Right.
They're doing the battle scenes. They're doing Helm's Deep, right? They're doing the Nazgul, and like I'm trying to find Frodo and Sam, cooking rabbit, having lunch, right? Really boring. Sounds like really boring stuff. But for me, that's what's fascinating about the story.
Do you have a favorite character to return to, or to work with when you're doing Tolkien stuff? Boromir.
Boromir. He is the most human of all the characters. I think he's fallible, right? He dies. He tries to steal the ring. But he doesn't do it for evil intent. He's just trying, like he says, he wants to save his people. He wants to help his people. Right? So yeah, so I like him, even though he's not in all of the stories. I like the idea of him, as a fallible, broken, slightly broken character in the books.
That's interesting because he is not visually doesn't have the grandeur of Gandalf with the wizard's robes and the hat and the
Oh, I love Gandalf too.
Well, no, of course. But it's interesting that you've chosen someone who is very human as opposed to someone who is immediately visually a fantasy thing. It's not an orc. It's not Sauron. It's not a hobbit. It's a wizard or an elf. It's just a person.
It's a human. It's just that, again, that goes back to like how I make my paintings. Like they're about humans. I'm making. So even when I'm doing hobbits, they're still humans to me. They're miniature, right? Even Tolkien wrote them that way. They're not trying to be aliens,
right?
They have human emotion. They have tea. They have 2 breakfasts, or third breakfast. Where's the third breakfast, right? Right? I mean, those moments are like what makes the books, right? That's great stuff.
Wrapping things up, but before I go, I'm curious, is there a dream project that you would have? If it's a series or a single or whatever genre, what would you like to tackle?
Oh, here it is. Let's see.
Oh, you get visuals.
Visual. Yep. This here is a rejection letter from HarperCollins because I've been wanting to do the Tolkien calendar. So that's about 20 years old there, that letter. But it was, that's my kind of dream job to do the Tolkien calendar. Yeah.
20 years chasing it off a denial.
And that's about the beginning point of when I started making all of my own Tolkien imagery, the paintings for myself. So when in a way, I turned that negative rejection and just transferred all of that energy into, okay, you don't want me to do the calendar? Here's what you're missing. And that's why I have like a 200-page book out right now of all Tolkien art that I've done. 200 pages.
Wow. That see what you missed.
That's right. That's it.
Yep.
Yeah. Right.
So now what you have to do is go out and buy the book, and between every page, put a calendar page in.
That's right.
And then you'll get the Donato, the unreleased Donato Tolkien calendar.
That's
right. Last question,
okay.
For real. What keeps you coming back to science fiction and fantasy? Many, many years on, why is this still work that you love to do?
It's just who I am. It is a part. I jokingly state that as I left cave drawings in my mother's womb for my brother to take a look at. I have been drawing, Brian, since I can't remember. I have drawings from my first grade class my parents saved. I still have them hanging up around the studio, a few of those. And so therefore, I mean, science fiction and fantasy, especially when, as I got the chance again to create a large body of material around gaming, around making those maps, not just like making a few one-off little sketches like most young kids do, but actually being able to throw myself into a world building event, building the world for my friends of Dungeons and Dragons, building the world of this game Omega Core, the science fiction world that my friends and I made, and throwing my creative talents into that production of material, drawing ships, drawing characters. I have books here just filled with hundreds of drawings based from that high school experience. And so that is who I am, really. I can't imagine doing anything else. There is no retirement. I mean, literally, you'll have to retire me like Decker does. You have to take me out to retire me from.
Wow.
Yeah.
On that note, and please, nobody go out and do that. There's a lot more art to be had from Donato. You can find Donato's work, galleries of his art at donatoarts.com, www.donatoarts.com, and we'll have that link down in the description. Donato, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Hey, it's been a great pleasure.
Always great talking to you. Come back every Tuesday for more Into the Ultra. We'll have a lot more interviews coming your way. See you then. Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching Into the Ultra. I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you want to see more, please subscribe. We drop new episodes every Tuesday. You can also check out some of my other projects. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I made a movie called Plastic Galaxy, the story of Star Wars toys, and I co-produced and co-directed a documentary called Eye of the Beholder, the art of Dungeons & Dragons. Both are available on Amazon Prime and iTunes and a host of other streaming services. And if you want to follow along with my newest project, I co-produced it with Cave Girl Productions. It's called Igniting the Spark, the story of Magic the Gathering, and I posted a link to that down in the description. Thank you very much. I hope to see you next Tuesday.